Hello again. In 1842, HMS Wilberforce arrived home in Plymouth. There's nothing surprising about this. Guz was one of the three main ports of the Royal Navy at this time. But when the crew disembarked, the locals might have been in for a bit of a shock, as all but three of them were West Africans. There was an African diaspora living in Britain, and there had been for some time, but it wasn't very big. Over the course of the previous century, there had only been between 10,000 and 15,000 people from the African diaspora in the country, and they were concentrated around the major ports of London, Bristol and Liverpool. During the 1700s, some of these would have been enslaved people. They were mainly imported by the super-rich to show off, in much the same way that the super-rich of today might show off with expensive art from the far-flung corners of the world. Most of the others were freemen who worked as entertainers or small businessmen. They might be selling fruit and veg, or the works by abolitionists such as Uludar Equiano, which were advertised with pictures of the famous Wedgwood medallion and its message, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Lord Mansfield's 1772 ruling meant that you could not keep a person enslaved within England. After that, no aristocrat would be willing to import an enslaved person, at great expense, as they could then decide they wanted to work for somebody else. But there were still people from the African diaspora coming to Britain, but they were mainly coming as free people, normally because they were employed as sailors. The Royal Navy accepted anybody that could pull on a halyard or reef a sail. It recruited everywhere it operated around the North Atlantic region, but during the Napoleonic Wars, only 24 men were recruited from Africa itself. There were people of colour, but they came from Britain's Caribbean colonies or America, including some escaped slaves. If you go down to Trafalgar Square, you will see one of these Afro-Caribbean sailors memorialised in bronze. This unknown sailor is on the frieze at the bottom of Nelson's column. He is standing close to the dying admiral and about to fire back at one of the French snipers. This frieze was made about 50 years after the event, but you can find them in contemporary prints as well. These sailors were joined from the 1850s by people of the African middle classes. They were the children of African lawyers and doctors, and they were sent from Sierra Leone or the Gold Coast for their education. But generally, over the course of the 19th century, the size of the African diaspora in Britain decreased. By 1900, one Sierra Leone man who was training in London to be a barrister wrote that there were only 100 Africans in the whole city. He was being hyperbolic, but it might have felt like that at times, as they only made up a fraction of a percent of the population. If you wanted to find a member of the African diaspora in Victorian Britain that you could talk to, then your best bet was to head down to the pub near the docks. The largest diaspora populations were still around the ports such as Liverpool, London and Cardiff, as they'd arrived as sailors with either the Mercantile Marine or the Royal Navy. In 1859, one recruiting party sent out to the pubs in Liverpool returned with 19 black sailors out of 33 men who had volunteered. However, there was practically no chance of recruiting parties coming back with an entire ship's crew made up of Africans, as there were just so few of them living in Britain. However, HMS Wilberforce was not just recruiting in Britain. For generations, the Navy had recruited directly from the crew-speaking peoples of West Africa. That's crew with a K, not crew with a C. The earliest records suggest that the first crewmen came from a group of settlements south of the Seno River, which today bear the names of Setra Crew, Nana Crew, Little Crew and Crewbar. If you think the names crew and crewman sound suspiciously close to the English words crew and crewmen, for people famous for being mariners, then you're right. One of the explanations for the name is that it is a corruption of the English word, and that they would have used while advertising their services to European captains. They were an independent and self-reliant people. As the crew proverb says, "You do not rely on the pot of your friend to feed you." When Liberia became independent in 1847, the American Colonization Society, which had founded it, concluded treaties extending Liberian territory all the way to the San Pedro River on the west of the Ivory Coast, except for the area around Setra Crew, where they refused to sign and remained independent. Crew people could be found in every aspect of maritime trade. They could be deckhands or stevedores, they could transport cargo out to larger ships, or they could arrange the cargoes themselves. Nearly every major account of West Africa written since 1820 pauses to describe the crew. By 1900, they had seized a share of nearly every opportunity for wage labour in the region, and the idea of being crew had expanded to all of the indigenous peoples from Sentos to Cape Palmas. Thousands of crewmen spent a great part of their lives in crew town areas that could be found in every major West African port. You could find them from Liverpool to South Africa, from the Panama Canal to Suez. They manned vessels of every size and helped explorers delve into the African continent up its rivers. As the great maritime trading nation, the dominance of British shipping tied the crew and the British together. Ships' officers and colonial officials universally admired them. The crew people's oral history and folklore, in turn, reveal an affection for the British. In the 19th century, the majority of crew labour continued to go to British colonies. While they were circulating stories of real and imagined abuses going on in French and German territories. But above all else, the crew liked to work for the Royal Navy. A berth on a ship of the West Africa Squadron meant a chance of coming home with tales of glory and pockets stuffed full of prize money. During the period when the slave trade dominated the West African coast, some crew people did become involved with that as well. But once Britain made its heel-face turn in 1807 and set up the West Africa Squadron to destroy the slave trade, it was the crew who became its strongest and most consistent ally. They threw themselves into the crusade against slavery and it became a core part of their identity. When they joined a ship, they picked a new name that they would use whilst at sea. The crew languages are tonal, like Chinese, and so very difficult for Europeans to pronounce correctly. These names could be something simple, like Ben Crew, or something more exotic if they try to transpose their real names into English. If you're looking down a ship's muster roll and you find a name that looks ridiculously nautical, you've found a crewman. They worked out their terms of service with the captain. This was normally one patrol and never more than a few years. They would also normally demand to be returned to the port that they had been recruited from or to their homeland. They could set their own terms because whenever the British needed to operate in the shallow waters where a warship could not go, the crew proved their worth as though they were the true masters of small craft. They were experts in navigating shallow inland waters. They had developed their own design of shallow 10-foot canoes made to ride out the coastline's high surf. On merchant vessels, they often took their canoes with them. This let them paddle home once the job was done, trading en route with the goods they had received in payment for their work. They received prize money just like any other member of a ship's company, and in most ways they were treated just like any other sailor. But they also had pride in their own West African identity and their skill as seafarers. They had a proverb, trying to show off through a white man in the water, which arose from a story about a European who was trying to show that he was as good a seafarer as the crew, and ended up drowning himself because he wasn't. Flogging was still an accepted part of naval discipline at this time, but a Royal Navy officer wrote in 1850 that because they have a national character to maintain, flogging was only permitted to be inflicted by the head crewman. A crewman feels it to be a great disgrace to be flogged by a white man. It wasn't just their skill that made them valuable. They were also immune to the local diseases, which would be deadly to unexposed Europeans. Disease had always been a problem in the close confines of a ship. Between 1774 and 1780, the Royal Navy lost 15 times more sailors to disease than combat. One ship of the West Africa Squadron lost 7 captains to disease in a single cruise during the 1840s. Because of this, the West Africans usually formed a large part of the landing parties that were sent to hunt slave traders ashore, and they built up a reputation for their bravery. One of these expeditions was when the Royal Navy attacked Lagos in 1850. A letter from one of the West Africans on HMS Volcano reached the newspapers back in Britain. He wrote how HMS Bloodhound crossed the bar at Lagos on Christmas Day towing 18 boats. As soon as they did, the inhabitants of Lagos opened fire on them from the shore and ran to their own boats to come out and fight. The fight lasted 3.5 hours with cannon fire from both sides. The Royal Navy force managed to get to the shore, only to be pushed back onto their boats under heavy fire. When they returned on the 27th, Midshipman Frederick Fletcher was assigned to guard the boats in order to give them an escape route if they were pushed back again. He died when 2 musket balls slammed into his forehead. Another midshipman died advancing with his men before Lieutenant John Corbett was able to spike the enemy's cannons and take them out of action. But he took a shot in his arm while he was doing so. The battle ended on the 28th of December when the king fled and his brother was installed in his place. After the Royal Navy had wiped out the last remnants of the Atlantic slave trade, the Admiralty decided to reduce its dependence on the crew for manning its ships. It issued an order in 1870 that no more were to be recruited, although many found ways around this prohibition and continued to serve. But to finish off this little talk, I'd like to go back to the letter written by that young Sierra Leone on HMS Volcano. The letter that got published in the newspapers had originally been sent to the headmaster of the school that he had attended. After describing the battle, he mentioned that he had recently been dining with the captain and his officers. He also asked to be sent a nautical almanac. There is only one reason that he'd want one of those. He was learning navigation, and that meant that he was planning to become an officer himself one day. The Royal Navy of this time was rather class-bound and been very difficult for him to make the jump from the lower deck to the quarterdeck. Becoming an officer on a merchant ship, however, was much easier. Anybody with the correct qualifications could become a captain of one of those, and I'm going to go through just how mercantile marine officers were trained next time.